Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we complete a two-day program on celebrating action in the face of the endangerment of over 1 million species around the world, including the human species, given how humanity has treated itself and treated the environment over the last century since the Industrial Revolution, but more specifically in the last 75 years as the economies of the world and international politics have forced globalization and the rise of neoliberal capitalism and a range of other factors that have led to humanity now teetering on the precipice of self-destruction. It's an extraordinary moment to be alive. And I wanted to bring in just one note that came to my attention yesterday. We had John Perkins on, whose book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, about 30 years ago became an international bestseller. He's now publishing his third edition. And we had a brief conversation about how the multilateral institutions around the world, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, various other institutions, World Trade Organization, act coercively against impoverished governments, to force them to negate social welfare and democratic institutions to ensure that the global corporations have easy access to resources without impediment. And Joseph Stiglitz today, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, has been working with the IMF and the World Bank and a variety of international institutions, wrote an article in which he decried that after all these decades and all the pressures against the international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank continue to act coercively around the world to destroy social welfare and democratic institutions, including, he said, the systemic use of initiating riots to effectuate their will. And he used as an example what's just happened recently in Sri Lanka, as there was riots and demonstrations and the collapse of a government, and then the rise of another government, and the only way to save the country was to go to the IMF and get bailed out again to the tune of billions of dollars. I think it was $2.2 billion, if I remember correctly. And what was the trade-off? The negation of social welfare, pensions, and democratic processes. So as we continue our discussion of our endangered situation, and we celebrate today, as we did yesterday, those individuals who are taking concerted action, we need to bear in mind that the matrix within which all of us are doing everything we can to enable humanity to rise and enable democracy to be preserved, to enable simple human decency and fundamental social welfare systems to prosper, that we're doing this against a concerted global orchestration on the part of our international organizations and our global corporations to break these processes down. And I think this is important, and I appreciate having someone like John Perkins in our counsel, as he has been over the last 18 months, but and again yesterday, so that we take note while we're watching the news that many of the events that we're seeing aren't just rising spontaneously into the ecosystem because people are dissatisfied and they want more rights. That's also true. But there's also a covert, coercive manipulation of the instruments of political power by international institutions who have certain agendas that are not in the interest of the people of the countries that they're manipulating, but they are in the interests of the global corporations interested in extracting resources and profitability. So given John Perkins yesterday and Joseph Stiglitz today in the news, I thought I would bring this in so that we have a deeper appreciation of the context within which all of us are living and taking action for a better world. Before we dive into our program, let us just pause, as we always do as we begin our sessions on Humanity Rising, and let us just simply breathe together. As I've said many, many times, and it's just worth repeating, that as the external chaos and turbulence in our social worlds and our political, geostrategic, and ecological worlds, as it increases, the most important thing that we can do is to take action in whatever way we can to deepen our internal coherence. Because if our internal coherence isn't as deep as the external chaos is strong, we can be swept away. And that's why we breathe together. And we do a very specific kind of breathing that is, according to modern science and ancient mysticism, a breathing technique that is designed in the shortest period of time to produce internal coherence. So in a moment, you're going to hear the sound of a bell. When you hear that bell, just start to breathe in for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear another bell. Breathe out for about 5.5 seconds. That gives you 5.5 breaths in a minute to bring in 5.5 liters of air. And it optimizes the synergies in every single one of your body systems. So that's why we breathe together. Because in Humanity Rising, as you all know, we keep up with unfolding world events. We try to look reality right in the eye, but always with a view of discerning the opportunities in the various crises that we face. And most fundamentally, coming together as a coherent community to take the actions necessary to enable humanity at this very precarious but optimized moment to take those actions necessary to ensure human survival and human abundance. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Let us breathe together, and then we'll commence our program. Thank you, everyone. It's always good to breathe as one. And it's in that coherence and in that spirit, it's my great pleasure to welcome Tom Eddington, partner in the development of Humanity Rising as we evolve toward Humanity Rising Network. He's a very successful business executive coach, and the founder of Endangered.global, who cares passionately about the environment, about nonviolence, and about how we revitalize the human spirit at this critical moment. And in the program yesterday and today, he's focusing our attention, not so much on the crisis, but on how we can celebrate those individuals who are taking action that are making a difference in our world. So Tom, thank you so much for everything that you do. And I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I'm going to start by just sharing that last night I had a chance to attend a lecture at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor with Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and UN Commissioner on Human Rights. And she shared not only the work that she's been doing, which is connecting human rights and social justice with climate change, but also just sharing that mankind has a serious problem, and it's womankind who is going to solve the problem. And so I'm particularly delighted to have Marie-Noëlle join us today from WeForest. She's the co-founder and CEO of the nonprofit WeForest that is focused on reforesting the planet, but more than just reforesting the planet. And after a very successful career in large corporations, she really focused and chose to align her work with her life's purpose and make a real difference in the world. Through WeForest, which is recognized for its holistic forest landscape restoration approach in African regions, as well as in South America and other parts of the world. So a warm welcome to you, Marie-Noëlle.
Thank you, Tom.
There were a couple of things that Mary Robinson shared last night that I wanted to bring into our conversation. She talked about the $1.8 trillion a year that goes to fund the fossil fuel industry around the world. And so that's a huge impediment to the transition to renewable energy and to mitigating climate change, or what I have over the last several years have realized it's climate disasters, not climate change. She also talked about the role that women are playing around the world to deal with both biodiversity loss, social justice, and climate change. And so I'd like to start with the work that you've been doing, Marie-Noëlle, and particularly the evolution. You and I have known each other for, I don't know how long, a dozen years or so.
Yes.
And for me, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of your thinking and the work of WeForest, from starting initially with thinking you had to plant 1,500 trees per acre to realizing that if we just put 500 trees per acre, Mother Nature will take care of the rest. And then moving from there to recognizing the importance of biodiversity, and then the impact of women and the impact of communities, and how you integrate food, so nut-bearing, fruit-bearing trees, into the reforestation activities. So you have beautifully evolved your thinking. And Jim mentioned yesterday the reference to the blind man and the elephant. And so each of us, as we are blinded by our inability to see the whole, we think that the elephant's tail is a rope, or the leg is a trunk of a tree, or the trunk of the elephant is a hose. And what I've so valued and appreciated about you is that you have both continued to do the action of planting trees, but you've also continued to work to try and understand the elephant. And so I'd love to just spend a little bit of our conversation today talking about the last dozen or so years and your evolution and your thinking.
Yes, thank you. That looks like quite a program. You raised so many aspects. Where do I start? Yeah, so maybe I can react a little bit. When we started WeForest with Bill Liao, my co-founder, indeed 13 years ago, we knew that women had to be at the core, because we know in so many countries in the world, and the global south, but everywhere actually, women are changing the world. I mean, look at what happened recently in politics. Women are in politics and then they step down when they feel like they don't add any value. Who does that in the male population, right? This is quite impressive. But just to get back to my comfort zone, which is restoring the planet and not going to politics, we knew women were going to be at the center. So that's clear. We knew a lot about permaculture and the solutions of how to transform the planet and bring the trees back and the tree cover. But indeed, as you pointed in your summary, over those 13 years, we have learned so much, and we continue to learn every day, because that is the only way you bring quality. Yeah, you've got to be humble. You don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. We are dealing, when we restore forests, with the most difficult thing, because you are facing nature. You don't know what's going to happen. There is no menu or no book to tell you what to do where, because things happen. And actually, the main lesson for me is that it's not about planting trees. It's funny, because we started as a tree planting organization, and it's absolutely not about planting trees. First, it's not about planting, as you alluded to. It's about growing and letting nature do a better job than we would do. Because if you plant systematically everywhere, you'll have a very high mortality. If you set the conditions for nature to take over and protect what you have, then it is much more sustainable and cheaper. But I think the main thing that I've learned with the team that we've grown is that actually it's really not about forestry even. We have all that expertise and we know inside out all the options, and we do that everywhere in the world, as you mentioned, and we are going to be reaching 100 million trees very soon, 100,000 hectares, and great. But actually that's not the work. The work is to, when you get somewhere, like we do in Ethiopia, first you have to look at what you have. You have an area that is not yet degraded. Around it, you have a whole area that is totally degraded, which is normally also the economic zone where people live. And because they have to survive, they cut all the trees. So then you look at this landscape and you say, what can I do with this? How am I going to transform it so that the people living in this economic zone around the area I want to protect are going to restore it and protect it in the long term? If I do that for 10 years or 20 years, the duration of the project, when I leave, I want it to, self-sustain and people take care of it. So that's the question. Has actually nothing to do with trees, because that's quite simple. It's like developing alternative livelihoods. So people see more value in a standing tree than in a felled tree. It is governance topic about training people how to manage the common good, how to together do more, how to be responsible for their environment, which alludes a little bit to the bigger problem that Jim was mentioning before, like how do we take care of our planet? So we see ourselves evolving from a tree forester organization into socioeconomic model development, into governance, into focusing with government in order to make sure that there is also policy to support what we do. So it is a learning every single day.
And what has kept you going throughout this period? I mean, it's certainly, there have been moments where it's been challenging for you. There's been moments where what's being asked is beyond the resources you have, the capabilities that you have.
Two things kept me going and actually give me energy every single day. And actually, sometimes I feel like adrenaline adrenaline fatigue, you know. I mean, like when you're on adrenaline all the time. But that's just the way I operate. The first one is I'm a little bit pessimistic of nature. Like, yeah, I worry about the world, and you know what Jim was saying, it resonates. And yeah, sometimes you want to sit there and cry because it is not all great. And the only way I found to circumvent that pessimism is action. When I'm in action, I've got no pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic because I've got no time for that. I just lose myself in action, and it gives me so much energy and so much joy. I just love it. And I would recommend that to anybody. It's like, forget about being optimistic or pessimistic. That is a luxury for this part of the world. The global south don't have time to look at being, am I pessimistic or optimistic? If I'm in Tigray and I'm being bombed for 2 years by my own government, and all the NGOs have left and the UN has left and left people alone, you don't have time to worry whether you're pessimistic or optimistic. You just do things to survive. Well, that's kind of the culture that we have. We're doers. So that's the first reason, like, you know, forget about being pessimistic and just do things. And the other one is, again, about Tigray in the northern part of Ethiopia, where I go regularly to see the project that WeForest develops. When I see the hope, the trust, and the results of what we do, the transformation we bring to those 23,000 families that we work with there, that's the biggest reward, and that keeps me going, and it will never stop me.
I'm currently working on a new film project, and it takes place in the southwestern part of the U.S. And there are a number of indigenous elders who are coming out of the kivas and sharing for the first time that humanity's at a choice point to evolve or devolve as a species. And it's up to us to make that decision about, are we going to evolve or are we going to devolve? And they're sharing the message now because they feel like for the first time in certainly the Western culture that we can hear the message. And last night in her talk, Mary Robinson shared that we're at a choice point, and she sees both of these competing realities. You've got the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. You've got the old systems, the old ways of doing things, the people in power, and this emerging interest in reforestation, in climate change, the urgency that's there, and the reality. And so we're at that choice point, and you've been living at that intersection since the beginning of WeForest. And in the early days, if I recall, you were going to places where you were well received, and you've had to make choices about, from a biodiversity perspective, from a societal perspective. And so some of the choices you were making, from my recollection, were planting around the equator. And so can you talk a bit about the choices you've had to make? And
indeed, we could plant, and we should plant trees everywhere, because I don't need to tell you, I think you all know the value of trees for water, for biodiversity, for people, for soil, for the food that we eat. I mean, it's just like the list is nonstop, right? So that's very clear. That's a given. It's a foundation. So we need to do that everywhere. However, we've chosen as an organization to focus in the tropics for several reasons. First, obviously, because as I said before, it's not about planting trees, it's also lifting people out of poverty, bring dignity back. Jim mentioned that word before. That's the only world worth living in, that everybody has dignity. Otherwise, what's the purpose, right? And so that's what we do. We bring dignity back, and you can make a huge difference in countries in the tropics, because these are actually the least developed countries. And then on top of that, in terms of the climate, not all of these regions, but most of these regions are warm and humid, which is also very good for the carbon sequestration. And so for many different reasons, we've chosen to plant in the tropics. Still, we love other organizations that work more in the northern hemisphere and other regions. It's just a choice that we made, and people ask us all the time, would you plant in Europe? Well, right now we wouldn't. Also because for the same money, you could do so much more in those countries. So let's go where we can have the biggest impact with the same cash, because obviously, it's always a question of the fundability of the projects.
I'm going to take our conversation into some of the science and the technical details. Something that surprised me was about 4 or 5 years ago, you and I were in conversation, and you were talking about the role that trees play in producing rain. And one of the biggest crises on the planet is water shortages. So can we go into a little bit of the science and then the role that trees play in creating rainfall?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to say something that is a little disruptive, is the whole world is focusing on the carbon. And this is super important, and we have to reduce our footprint, number one, and we have to plant trees and grow forest in order to capture as much carbon as we can. That is an emergency, that is clear. But there's something that is hidden that we have no idea of, or most people don't, I mean, the scientists do, obviously, is that the water cycle could have maybe an even bigger impact on climate. And it is starting to come out in scientific work. They're still arguing about some little details, but overall, you can say that the water cycle is probably as important as the carbon cycle for the climate in different ways. In the evapotranspiration, in the cloud nucleation, for example, the leaves of the trees have microparticles that evaporate. And in order to transform water vapor into clouds, you need those particles to exist. So if you don't have trees, you probably would have, with water and heat, you'll have just vapor, to make it super simple. Where you have trees and vegetation, where microparticles evaporate from those trees and from that vegetation, those microparticles seed the clouds. So they transform water vapor, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, which is negative, into something positive, which is a cloud, which will cool the planet because it will protect the planet, and it will create rain, which will feed the watershed. So just super simplified, because I'm not the expert on this and I'm not accredited to do that, just summarizing the top of the iceberg of what's possible. So our objective is to bring together, and we've already done that in the past, we're going to continue doing that, bring together those top scientists around the world so that this message can become mainstream. Because then we are moving the discussion from just carbon, which becomes very mercantile and very people critique it because they say they're just greenwashing and everything. Talking about water takes it away from all this greenwashing. It's like, look at the potential just for the climate, to cool the planet, but also to bring water back, to reduce the water storms, because where you have forest, you have more steady precipitation than when you don't have forest. There's another thing I'd like to say very briefly, just to show you all the aspects of this water cycle. There's a theory called the biotic pump, which is, say, just as an example, that California was getting to become a desert, right? That's not happening, we know that, right? But say that it would happen. Well, if you planted sufficient trees and forests along the coast of California, that phenomenon, that would create a phenomenon of attracting humidity from the ocean and bring precipitation to the land. That's been demonstrated by top scientists, and that's part of this water cycle discussion. So imagine the potential here. And I know some people are already working on that. I know people are trying to reforest California, but we need to do it big time and quickly. It's like there is no time to waste. So I'm not a pessimistic. I just think we need to act now, and we don't have to wait for the others to do it. Each of us can start. Each of us, when we go to the store and we see a product that we plant a tree as opposed to another product that doesn't plant a tree because that brand has decided to plant a tree for every product, but choose the one with a tree. Don't care who does it, just it's good, it's a tree. And that's what, and all of you, if you have a garden, plant some trees. I mean, just let's go for that, and then support all these organizations that are trying to do this.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the products. One of the things that attracted me to WeForest and supporting the work you've been doing is the business model that you created. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time just you coming out of the commercial sector and bringing that mindset into creating a nonprofit that was self-sustaining. So can we talk a little bit about the business model?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for that. Well, indeed, I have a corporate background. And when I started WeForest, my thought was, let's make it simple for corporates. The big ones have the means, have the teams, but smaller organizations don't always know and don't have the resources. But let's make it easy for everyone, even the very small organizations, to contribute to nature. So that is the model that we developed because of my personal background. And indeed, I like to bring the discipline that I've learned in the big multinationals into the NGO world, which I think is important because rigor, integrity, and say what you do and do what you say. And you see, be transparent about everything. I think that is a quality across the board for nonprofit or for profit, and everybody should be playing that. So what we do is we have different options. We started with a lot of marketing activities with brands that were already, I mean, good brands and doing a lot of things as well in their own supply chain, reducing their footprint, because that's very important. You want to, if people are going to promote what they do, they better be good. So we have to do some due diligence, obviously. So we did that a lot. Now we are working with a diversity of options, companies like us, and they just donate to us. Or also we have developed carbon certified projects. So we have companies that are also reducing and that choose to offset what they cannot reduce with us. And so that is a third option that we have. There's one thing I would like to say, responding a little bit to Jim's comment about corporates. We often see them as the bad guys who did all the bad things that happened to us. But actually, I would see it a little differently, like we are collectively responsible because we're all consuming too much. And so I think it's like there's not one part of the society that is responsible more than the other. Everybody is part of this. And so we have to change by changing ourselves, doing more with less. And the way I see it also, I work with a lot of corporates, and obviously the best ones, the ones that are committed to transforming this world, to cooling the planet, to becoming net positive, like neutral, carbon neutral. So I have the privilege of working with over 500 companies of the best brands and small and big to do that. And I see an authentic commitment of these companies and of the people working there to really do something. And honestly, I think it's not going to come from the governments. It's not going to come from the individuals at the scale that we need. So the only organizations that are going to get us out of this chaos are the corporates. And that's why we have to work with them, make it easy for them, and expect big ambitions and make it happen with them, not against them.
What are you seeing with the corporates as they're getting clearer about what is their scope 1, their scope 2, and their scope 3 footprint?
Yes. I mean, some countries have established new laws, like I think it's in France, for example, which I know a little better. If you have over 200 employees, you have to do your footprint. So that is already a very good move. And in every country, I would expect that this is starting to come. So because then they have to start looking, and when they realize their footprint, they want to act, because intrinsically these people want to do good. They want to leave something better for their children. They're not just after money, because otherwise they wouldn't be running a company for many years. I mean, right? So yes, that's what I see happening with the companies. Yeah.
And when we look at, and we've been talking about trees, but you've been doing work with mangroves as well. So we're at the intersection of the water systems around the world and the land masses. And can you talk about that?
Yes, we started 3 years ago a mangrove project in Senegal, and yeah, it is a fascinating environment indeed, very different from the other forests that we did in Zambia and in Brazil and in Ethiopia. And indeed, it requires a very different approach. For example, over there, you've got to study the salinity of the water. You have to watch the rising of the ocean to see if they're not going to be underwater. It is a very different reality than reforestation in the mountains, for example. So that has pushed us into very new directions of scientific research, where we are we established flux towers in that project in Senegal, where we measure the different greenhouse gases ongoingly. So this is like very innovative, and we are fortunate to be supported by sponsors that fund that and that like that and that bring their excellence in that as well, because the funders don't only bring money. We like to look for funders that come with a bigger solution. They have expertise in things that we don't have, and they bring that to the projects, and that's what we like in our partnerships. And so another thing that we do, which is quite amazing over there, is we do eDNA. So we sample the water, and through the eDNA, we see what animals live there, what animals have returned. So that is also very interesting, as everyone is looking at biodiversity. Remember, that's like we talked about the different impact of forests. Well, biodiversity is one of the top ones, and everybody's interested. It's very difficult to measure. Like, how do you measure all of a sudden that animals are returning? Well, we're doing that in Senegal with the eDNA. We're doing that in Brazil with the sound from Rainforest Connect, that you know. And then we're doing that also in Brazil with camera traps. So we see animals. So it's like we always on the move. As I was saying when we started, we're always learning every day and using technology and getting people to help us to get better. That's a little bit who we are at WeForest.
And what are you doing with the measuring the microbiome in the soil and the soil health as the forests start to mature? It's not been too much of our focus right now. For example, if in Senegal, it's tricky because if you want to do that, it's going to be a long process. And I think we'll do that over time during the certification period, which is a 30-year process. So I think this is part of it, but it's just starting, because we started a project 3 years ago, and indeed there's a baseline, and then we're going to be seeing how the soil gets better, indeed, and it sequesters more carbon, which is also the roots of the mangroves, for example. But that is a very long process, and it's not the one that we're doing most. Yeah. You mentioned earlier you're close to 100 million trees, and that was the goal from the inception. But the journey has been circuitous, with focusing on hectares rather than trees, and ecosystems rather than planting. And so I'm just wondering, what do you view as the most important metrics of success for WeForest and other organizations that are?
Yeah, that is a super question. And actually, even with 100 million trees, 100,000 hectares, if you look at it, it is a drop of water on hot sand compared to the trillion trees that we need, right? Because that's kind of what we need to establish. We need to restore and protect the size of the US, the size of China, huge. And we need to do that fast. So where we are continuing to do, but we are thinking that eventually our impact should be more in getting others to replicate. That is what we are trying to figure out now. And that's where we are looking for partners that want to embark on this with us. Because if WeForest doubles every year, great, wonderful, love it. But it's not going to be enough. So, but if WeForest was sprouting 100 WeForests every year around the world in different shapes and forms, right? Small NGOs around, babies of WeForest everywhere. That'd be amazing. And so we're starting to think, how could we do that? We don't know yet. So we open this question to the world and had some thinking yesterday with Bill on that, but that's where we should take it. And this is also not just for an organization like WeForest, it's for every one of us. How can we make other people around us bigger and share and empower like we do with our children, do that with everybody. That's humanity rising.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And that's a conversation we've had over the years is you're planting the trees that you're planting and restoring the ecosystems that you are, but we're destroying more than we're planting. And we were already 1 trillion trees short of where we needed to be. And so it's critical that the message of your work get out there in the world, along with all the other organizations that are doing tree planting. But we truly need replication by as many organizations as possible.
You're right, Tom, because if we look at the statistics today, we're losing this race. On the other hand, as I said when I started, it's just like putting our head in the sand and crying is not going to resolve it. So getting in action and training people on the importance of forests, inspiring everyone to act, supporting others who do, like, they might not do it perfectly, but they'll start and they'll learn and they'll get better.
Yeah, I think the piece that with the deforestation activities that are happening that people seem to forget is that if you take a 30-year-old tree and you take it down, then you need to plant at least 30 trees to replace that one tree that was removed. Yeah,
that's it, because there's nothing like a standing tree, and that's why we have to protect, and that's the point, the key message indeed.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So what does the next couple of years look like for you and WeForest?
It's really about inventing new ways to have a different kind of impact. Like also we have in our DNA, it's not about us getting medals and being shiny and famous. Don't care. We're probably not like most NGOs. We just want to get things done. And so we love working with others. We always go somewhere and say, okay, who's smarter than we are? Who knows better about this and that? Okay, then you do that and we do that. And right, that's so because we don't need to be stretched on all those different aspects. Because as I said, when you go somewhere and you want to restore this landscape, you've got to look at forestry, livelihoods, governance. That's a lot of different things in geographies that are sometimes new to us, where other people have been there. So it's like finding the right people, the right partners to do more together. So that's what we're going to continue doing, and more and faster.
And how are you putting the information that you're doing out there for other organizations, this learning curve that you've been on now for 13 years, to help accelerate their activities?
That's a fundamental one, and that's new for us. We are open source, so everything we do is available. Everybody can use it, but you're right. How do we get it there? And that's what we have to figure out. And if some organizations have already done that, would like to help us, take what we have and help us create this accelerator, it'd be super.
Yeah, you and I have spoken before about Trees for the Future and the work they've done over the last 30 years and making everything open sourced on their platform. Anybody can access their information, and unfortunately, it's a great resource, but not as many people know about it as need to, and that's part of the challenge.
That's part of the challenge, and on top of that, it's only part of what they need. If you go and see a small NGO in Uganda and they need help, they need some help on how to plant, what to plant and everything, but they need help on how to fundraise. They need help about setting up the governance, on their own finance, their legal, their hiring contracts, all kind of needs. So giving out just that part is super, but is not enough. And so how do we make that? I don't have the answers, but definitely we have a lot of those questions on the table.
I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and there's been lots of conversations in the chat around the oceans and restoring the oceans and the ability for the oceans to sequester CO2 and promote biodiversity in the oceans. We certainly know topsoil. We've lost about half the Earth's topsoil in the last 150 years, which is a huge opportunity for carbon sequestration. We know grasslands is a huge opportunity for carbon sequestration. And so I want to acknowledge the folks in the chat who are talking about grasslands, topsoil, and the oceans, because they're all essential and play a piece in addition to reforestation. I think for me, the overarching challenge is with each of these sectors is just changing human behavior. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about human behavior change and what you do when you go into projects and how you take that on. It's I'm assuming the biggest challenge is not the science.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is indeed reaching out to all these people who live there and giving them a sense of ownership. And when the projects start bringing income because of what they grow as a community, or because maybe of the carbon finance that will bring some cash, how do you make it work with, I was saying governance, I was very abstract, but very specifically is how do you make sure women get what they deserve and it's not grabbed by the male population or the chief of the village. So those are very important and real topics that we are working on in every landscape very differently. So it's about training. It's about making the people develop actually their own project. That those are the strongest ones. If you come from abroad and then you tell people what to do, it's not going to fly. People have to find their own solutions. You could just be an engine of awareness and funding and coaching, but it has to come from the communities. Any other type of project won't succeed. And we have seen, unfortunately, organizations come and go. And that is actually very bad, very detrimental to the populations, because you make them dependent, you make them passive, and you want the other way, you want the opposite. Yeah. So it's all about training and communicating, which is hard because local language, illiterate people, difficult.
Can we take this conversation down into some of the projects and what you've seen over the years on the local level? And we can pick whether it's in Ethiopia or in northern India.
Ethiopia. Yeah, I'd like to describe Ethiopia because that is quite something. I talked about it a little bit, right? These people, imagine these people, they live very remotely from the capital of the country, Addis, but also very remotely from the capital of the province in Tigray, which is Mekele. So they come once in a while. It takes them half a day with donkeys and stuff to the market to sell their produce, but then they go back. So that's how often they come to the city, which is actually a big village. These people live in the middle of nowhere in the highlands, quite hilly and remote, as I described. And they have half a hectare, so an acre, to live on with their family. Families often are quite small now, because when you look at those families in those places, there's old people and children, because especially the male of a young age or young adults have gone. They've emigrated to try to earn some money in Europe or in the Middle East. That is very sad reality. And so these families, I was mentioning before, 23,000 families in the 30,000 hectares, 60,000 acres that we work on in Tigray. They cultivate their land day in, day out. The kids go to school in the nearby village, and they have a few sheep and a few chicken, and that's how they live. And then they sell their eggs and stuff. Well, working hard all year doesn't enable them to eat all year. So 4 months or 5 out of the year, they have to rely on US aid to eat, although they work all year to cultivate their land. Why is that? Because of the droughts, because of the pests, but primarily the droughts and the fact that soils are getting very, very poor. So there is no solution to that. These people are just going to get poorer and poorer unless we do something. The other reality is they have to walk, and mainly the girls, the young girls, when they're done from school, they go and fetch the water for drinking, for the animals, or they take the animals for grazing. That's the routine. I mean, it's amazing because I love this. And then when you're there, you feel like you are taken centuries back. Mm. It's incredible. Yet it's beautiful. I'm not saying this is misery. This is like beautiful. It's just very hard, because when you know you can't feed your family all year and you're dependent on US aid, this is quite terrifying, isn't it? So I get very moved by this. And so what we're bringing with our project, and this is a unique place in Tigray, where the Tigrayan government, for some reason, they are very different even from the other states in Ethiopia, have with the communities an agreement where the communities are very, work a lot together, and they have a commitment to restore their forest and their land. They have to work for free so many days a year to restore, which I've not seen anywhere else in the world. When talking about a community commitment, it's huge. So these people come, and some days are free because that's what they have to do, but other days, obviously, they're paid, so they get an income from the work that they do with WeForest. They work in the nurseries, others go and plant the trees. First, before planting the trees, they dig holes, which is also some work in order to retain the water. So you can really visualize the kind of work that these people do to earn a living with us. So that's in the short term, where they get some funding for the daily lives. And then in the longer term, the projects that we support are in forestry, but also we distribute chicken, we distribute sheep, and also beehives, so that they can make an income. And all those combined, we are already, after several years, starting to look how the income is growing for these people. So this is the biggest reward we can have, like really measurable, tangible results. And let me just add something just to show you how fragile that is. When 2 years ago, the war broke out between Tigray and the federal government in Ethiopia, which we heard in the news a few times, but it was very quickly covered by other things much more interesting and important. So people didn't speak about it, but actually the banks were closed, the stores were closed, these people were bombed. There were Eritrean soldiers coming to loot the houses, the offices. I mean, just women being raped, everything stolen, really, really dramatic. And the people that we know, right? So we saw that happening. And obviously all the international organizations, the UN, everybody left. Everybody left because it was super dangerous. Well, our team, which is based in Mekelle State, And so we were the only NGO staying in the entire area. And we thought, what are we going to do? It's absurd to go and say to these people, we're going to continue planting trees. I mean, these people had nothing to eat. The stores were closed. They had no earnings, no markets, nothing. The banks were closed. And so my team said, we have to do humanitarian support. So I said, but that's not something we know how to do. So we thought about it for a day, and then we say, we have to do it. We have no choice. How can we ever look at these people in the eyes if we don't do that? So we did that. We raised money, and then we imported wheat and barley, 40 truckloads to bring to this family just before the planting season. So not that they could eat wheat and barley, but they could plant so they could eat the following year. And that's, for us, that's the raison d'être. That's why we're here, and that's worth anything in the world. Just blessing.
It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. You know, it's important that we talk about the things we have been talking about in terms of the work that WeForest is doing, but to bring it down to people's lives and their day-to-day interactions and sharing those stories. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I know that there are other stories, whether it's in Tanzania or the work you've been doing in Brazil, or the Kashi Hills in northern India, where you've got similar stories, similar experiences, that you're having a real impact, not just on climate, but in people's lives.
So we're blessed to be able to do that.
Well, I'd like to invite Jim back into our conversation today, and have a little more of a conversation with Jim before we wrap up.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marie-Noëlle. And, you know, given what at least I read about what was going on in Tigray, the courage that you demonstrated in staying there and proactively trying to help those people is quite extraordinary, because my understanding was that the war was brutal and intractable, and, you know, in many places there was just no place to hide because of the brutality of the war. And I just would love to, since we're on that since you raised it, would love to hear your larger sense of you know, how the war started and how it came to an end, because we hear about these civil wars, you know, as you say, in the news, and it catches the attention for a day or two and then gets drowned out with everything else that's going on, and we tend to lose track. But would love to hear a fuller account, as you understand it, of why it happened and how it transformed, and whether, in your sense of things, the peace agreement that was recently negotiated is real, and will it hold, and how has that all affected the efficacy of your work?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for asking. I'm not an expert in geopolitics, and even if I find that fascinating and very informing, right? But what I've read is, well, first, we have always seen ethnic instability and conflicts in Ethiopia. It's like when you have one ethnic that is at the government, then they favor their own, and then they don't represent the others. So it's like all of a sudden there's, like, the Tigrayans are at the central federal government, and then everything's fine, and then people from Amhara come, and then they take over. And so it is a little bit ongoing. And unfortunately, it doesn't show like there aren't any signs of real permanent solution for that. Even if the president, just before the war, got a Nobel Prize for Peace, if you remember that, which is quite a paradox and just unbelievable. So that is there. What I have read, and this is harder to substantiate, and obviously I'm not an expert, but there are some international influences for example, the Western countries are supportive of Tigray, and then maybe Russia was much more supportive of the federal government. So there are some things like that happen in the background and that perpetrate this kind of conflict. So there are more things that we don't know about, but international influences. And Africa is starting to suffer, not just Ethiopia, but you've seen that in the news, big time of international and it's not land grabbing, it's continent grabbing by some evil countries, if I can say. So it is getting very complicated, like the French being kicked out of Sahel and Burkina Faso and taken over by the Wagner and Russian troops, which is very worrying, very worrying. So difficult. New type of colonialism, and I'm just wondering why the Africans don't see that coming. Like, it's a new colonialism which is going to be as bad as the previous one or worse. It's difficult.
Yeah, well, just to refer back to John Perkins and Joseph Stiglitz that I brought in this morning. To your point, the international context, it's an extraordinary thing that on the one hand, you've had, like in Africa, 500 years of colonialism, now the neo-colonialism of the international institutions. So on the one hand, the Western interests are destabilizing and manipulating countries so they can extract resources. And on the other hand, there are people like you and all kinds of NGOs that are going into that very situation that's being fomented and exacerbated by the West to help ameliorate the situation. So in some ways, it is the West combating the West with a country like Ethiopia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is even a more extreme case. And the poor Africans in whatever country are laid waste in a perpetual extraction machine where you're dealing with escalating problems with obviously much more limited resources and capacities. And it must feel like a losing battle at times, just to know that there are forces much bigger than you. And then you bring in China, and the Wagner Group and we're
really working on transforming, Jim, the individual people's lives. We are not in politics because it's just not for us, and it's not relevant. Where we're happy when we see a happy family and kids going to school and people having dignity and women being respected in the villages where we work. Well, also one thing is, I was a few years ago at a big international conference in Brussels where I live, the government of Ethiopia was trying to recruit investors to come and invest in Ethiopia. So I was there because I thought it was interesting, met some ministers and stuff. And I stood up there and I said, guys, what I'm doing is just the opposite of what you guys are doing. You're creating factories and attracting all these people that live on land to live a miserable life in the cities or around Addis. And what we're trying to do is have them stay where they are with dignity and with a good life. So we're totally doing the opposite. And they were kind of shocked and didn't like it.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Well, in a related question that Stan Pokras put in the chat was around ecotourism. And I'm just wondering, even though this isn't specific to trees and kind of women's and family empowerment as you're leading, but I'm just wondering, are there other ways in which people in the West can support communities in addition to giving, donations and support for actually planting trees? And what's your general thought about ecotourism? Because that's spoken about, whether it's in the Amazon or various parts of of Latin America and the global South, where they're pristine areas of the ecology that are still basically intact, but being encroached upon by international interests. So does that play a role at all in what you're doing?
I think as a consumer, Jim, everything that we buy, we have to be super critical. We have to check, where is the wood coming from? Where's the paper coming from? Is it sustainable? Is it deforesting? You see, we have to be very responsible when we purchase as a consumer. We have to be very responsible when we vote, because we have to vote for people who are going to pass the good laws for the environment. That is super important. We all forget that very often. And then when you mention ecotourism, yes, it is potentially an income. I'm seeing something very interesting. After COVID, we've all learned to work remotely. And you've seen that a lot of companies are saying, I don't care where you work, as long as you show up and you do your work, you could sit anywhere in the world. And now that more regions have Wi-Fi, I'm seeing this as an opportunity, actually, that people from richer countries would go to stay in the global South for not just tourism, because tourism could be, you fly to Barcelona for 3 days and then you have a huge footprint and then doesn't do any good. But say that, some of us would be going and staying several months in a developing countries and working from there, then you bring real economic value to that country. So that it's not just tourism during 1 or 2 months a year, which is totally disruptive to a stable economy, but it brings more residents with cash that can support. So I see that as potentially a positive contribution to countries that are more remote and that have less income.
Yeah. And just as an inquiry more deeply into what you do, since we're celebrating people like you in this program, would love to hear of all the projects you've had over the years, what would you say was your greatest success? Maybe 2 or 3 of the projects that you think you would assert to be really stellar.
I have already spoken a lot about Ethiopia, and this is the biggest.
You would consider that one of your great achievements?
That is one, because it is unique because of the contribution of the people, as I said, and the scale and the transformation we're bringing. That's definitely a big one. Another one is in Zambia. In Zambia, I started many years ago with a very small project in the copper belt. And now we have a team of about, I'm saying close to 50 or something people, 45 or something, which are working on multiple projects in that region and being recognized by everyone in Zambia as a key player, as an important player, influencing policy, working with the government, working with other players, creating big corridors to connect different projects together. So in Zambia is probably where we have the biggest positive footprint because of the different projects we've done. Where else? I would say, it's probably those 2 countries are on the top of the list. We have big expectations for Malawi, which is a difficult country, which is right now suffering a huge cyclone, which is very dramatic. Like, I was there 3 years ago in a cyclone. It was terrible, but now it is like even worse. It's just like unbelievable what hits these countries that have nothing, that live in sheds. And then you got these storms and then everything is gone. You can't see the roads anymore. So this is pretty dramatic. But Malawi, more specifically, is one of the most populated countries in the world. And so the population pressure makes it so challenging to reforest, because every time there's something growing, it's taken. A little bit like you have in Haiti, right? So it is, but still we've decided to create a legal entity, and we have a team of 6 people that is working there, and we already started working with a partner for the last few years. So Malawi, we have big hopes as well to contribute. We don't pick the country because it's easy. We pick it because we have to resolve things. So we're unstoppable, basically.
You're a force of nature. Are
My
you
team is
working in South
unstoppable.
Asia at all?
Not yet. We are, well, actually, it's not true. We have started a pilot in Indonesia. Yeah, agroforestry in Indonesia. In a very
I was
important
reading
part
just
of the world.
today that the World Health Organization and the International Weather Bureau, not sure that's the right name, but that monitors weather and pollution around the world, is identifying South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., and even into the Middle East as the most heavily polluted area of the world, where the air pollution is just almost unbreathable. And I was wondering whether you have any projects there, because that's a whole region of the world where deforestation and the denuding of the environment is reaching really a critical mass. As you remember, Pakistan, I think a third of the entire country was covered by water last year. And so there's so many areas of the world that are critically in need of the kind of work that you're doing. So the demand on your organization and your time and your attention must be extraordinary. How do you make decisions?
Yeah, that's my role as a CEO, is to keep us on reasonable things, like to safeguard the organization, to not take every opportunity that comes our way. With the passion that I have in my team, I have to stop them, because otherwise we will have a new project every day. So that's my role, to kind of say, okay, let's walk before we run. But actually, maybe on this panel, there are a few people who have the opportunity to start something, to explore, to contribute. And, everybody can do that. We've done it. Everybody can do that.
And the final question I would ask you, Marie-Noëlle, is around, since you're in Brussels and you're obviously focused in a very specific way in the kind of the target countries that your organization chooses, how do you find the general attitude and support, say, in the EU or among the European governments with which you're interacting? Do you find that they're aware? Do you find that they're willing to support you at the level that you really need? Is there apathy? When I forget exactly what I think you said, or Tom at the beginning of or Mary Robinson, is the trillions of dollars that are going into the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So are you meeting, what is the reception for what you're doing sort of in Europe and among the international agencies that you deal with?
Yeah, well, actually, this is not where we deal. I mean, we work primarily with foundations and corporates. We don't directly access public funding. We have been in talks with different governments, but we don't get any funding, unlike other NGOs that are specialized in that. Because if you do that, you have to set up an entire team just to deal with the bureaucracy. So we don't do that.
Totally. It's its own project.
Yeah. So what we do is we work with others who have that, and they get the public funding. So for example, in the Sahel is a critical landscape, a critical biome, because we have to stop the desert from progressing. So it's what we also call the Great Green Wall, right? Which for us goes from Senegal to Ethiopia. And we have a project in Ethiopia that I already mentioned, but we also have one in the northern part of Senegal, which is not the mangrove, which is like in the dry land, in the desert. And this has been recognized as a failure in the last decade, where everybody was talking about the Great Green Wall. We need to green that. It didn't work out. Although there was a lot of public funding thrown at it and to big organizations and stuff. So we said, okay, we still want to try it. So we've partnered with different players, with Veterinarians Without Borders. This is an organization that works with herders in the field and takes care of the herders. They're not into forestry. They're good at helping the herders. And we are good at forestry. So together, we came together and said, we're going to do a pilot with an open source approach of everything that we learn, we're going to share, and anybody can replicate in the Sahel. So that's what we're doing right now. And these people have actually a bigger structure and they're more organized towards getting public funding. So they will get matching funding from the public, from the French government, where we will get private funding. So that's how we try to leverage that. So I don't have an answer to, how the people from the European Commission support us directly when we speak at some opportunities. They're always very friendly and supportive, but we don't get any funding for that.
Right.
It's just too heavy. And, I understand they have very heavy ways of controlling where the money goes, but it makes it then inaccessible for NGOs that are really committing to doing things. You need to be just focused on getting that money, which is different professional career, I would say, different direction.
You're a wise CEO to avoid the thicket of the bureaucracies and go where the money is more accessible, but also collaboratively. That's a really a wonderful strategy. So one other just quick question comes to mind, because we've had a number of programs on Humanity Rising around the intelligence of trees and the larger ecosystem. We've had people that are tree whisperers that communicate with trees, and there's a whole body of research, as you know, about how trees communicate with each other and with other species in a larger ecosystem. And I'm just wondering, given the fact that all over, what is your personal experience of trees? Do you have a certain kind of resonance with trees? Do you think of that's just not in your domain? But if you're dealing with trees as a way of life, really, I would just wonder what your spiritual relationship with trees, how it's evolved over the years.
I like your question, Jim. It's a very nice one to conclude this amazing discussion. When I have to live where there are trees. Like in my house in Belgium, we have forest. In my house in France, we have a lot of forest. And I run every day, and I run in the forest. I need that. Just it's a question of survival. And when I finish my run, I go lean against the tree and I thank the tree.
Beautiful.
It's my ritual. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Get a lot of energy from it.
And probably in the end, that communion gives you strength that's required for you to do the work that you need to do. So thank you for that, Marie-Noëlle. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Tom, any final comment?
I'm just so grateful we finished this conversation on that note. It's a perfect way to celebrate you and WeForest and the work that you're doing, just to make it very personal, and that connection to trees, to nature, and to humanity. So thank you for all your work, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Take
care.
Thank
you, Marie-Noëlle. Thank you, Tom. And that brings us to a close, everyone. You'll see the chat, in the chat, the link to the after chat function. And in your email that you received to remind you of this call, there's a link to the after chat, those of you who can join. And then tomorrow, we're going to be hearing from someone who's been on Humanity Rising before, John Montgomery, who's just published a book called Net Zero, and like Marie-Noëlle, is passionate about the environment and what the corporate sector can do to provide leadership, given the critical nature of global conditions, to bring us all into a more abundant world. But Marie-Noëlle, you've been inspiring today. I really want to thank you, and God's speed and God blessing on everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.